10 o'clock. Now, an advocacy group in St. Paul recently urged members of the House Health and Human Services Policy Committee in Minnesota to say no to a bill that's out there that would put steeper taxes on prescription drugs in Minnesota. It's another issue that is truly taxing all of us when it comes to health care. Jason Flohrs is the state director with the Minnesota chapter of a group called Americans for Prosperity. And Jason, something that you had just put out recently talking about the opioid tax and how it punishes patients. Explain a little bit about what that entails and how you're working for consumers.
Look, there's no question that the opioid epidemic is a serious problem facing the state of Minnesota, and I think there is a role for government there to fund recovery programs, to fund mental health programs and addiction programs that are related to that epidemic. But for the state to be considering putting an additional tax on prescription drugs when we know that consumers across the state are already struggling to afford their health care, that's just not the right approach.
So your group would like to see the tax go to the pharmaceutical companies?
Oh, no, we don't want there to be an additional tax or an additional registration fee of any kind. Look, right now we have in this state a projected $1.5 billion surplus after we already put money into the state's rainy day fund. This is simply not the time to be raising taxes of any kind, let alone raise taxes on prescription drugs that people are already starting to afford. So we're going to fund government-sponsored programs, and I think that is probably a good thing for the state to be investing taxpayer resources in. Let's do it with money that we've already collected rather than adding additional government-imposed costs to healthcare.
When you say that you work for economic freedom or you work on economic freedom type of issues, besides the opioid, as we've been talking a lot this week about the possibility of legalizing recreational use of marijuana in Minnesota, does this tie in at all?
The thing with recreational use of marijuana, I think that's a long step for Minnesota to take. We've already passed and considered medical marijuana use, and that could be tied into this opioid conversation a little bit. The way we've approached a recreational marijuana conversation is knowing that from a criminal justice reform perspective, we're sending a lot of teenagers to doing some very hard time based on low-level drug offenses, and that's putting a serious barrier up in front of them for the rest of their lives. So if we could reform some of that sentencing on the front end, make sure that kids who are using drugs are getting the help and the resources that they need and giving them a true second chance if they've already been in the system, that's something that we could focus on from a criminal justice perspective related to marijuana.
Where do you see lawmakers taking your group, your initiative? Do you see lawmakers really responding?
I think the challenge in this particular cycle is that you have a new governor and a new House majority who right out of the gates of this session have already talked about increasing taxes on gasoline and transportation, on electricity, on reinstating the provider tax, now adding this tax to prescription drugs as well. And when you have a budget surplus where the state is already projected to over-collect by $1.5 billion the revenues that they need to run the state, that's just not a good time to be raising taxes at all. So I think it's going to be very difficult with the House and the Senate working together to come up with too many of these tax increases that lawmakers are going to want to go back to their constituents in the summer and say that they've added these additional taxes.
Do you see that sometimes they say, well, you know what, we're not going to tax then the average taxpayer. We're going to add a registration fee or we're going to raise a registration fee or whatever, however they want to word it, to these companies, the pharmaceutical companies, whatever. But then companies pass it along to consumers anyway.
They do, and there's a great document prepared by the governor's own revenue department called the Tax Incidence Study. It's a little economic in its nature, but basically it shows that when you pass these kind of taxes, and the corporate tax is another one similar to it, those taxes are then absorbed, they become a part of the cost of doing business, and those costs are passed on to the consumer. That's why we talk about not wanting to add any additional prescription drug costs on the backs of consumers who are already struggling to afford their health care.
Yeah, well, I'm one of them, so I appreciate your time today, Jason, and your insight on this. Jason Flohrs with Americans for Prosperity, Minnesota. Thank you.
Thank you.